Imagine a world where the US government knows that children are being trafficked, and not just trafficked, abused, ritualistically and systematically. Imagine the victims testified, they named names, they provided evidence, flight logs, locations, dates, and photographs. Now imagine those victims who spoke up were silenced for doing so, and those they accused, well, they became even more powerful, or they simply disappeared. Far-fetched and hard to imagine, I know, but bear with me. Today we're going to talk about a time when that happened. And not that time, another time that happened. The Franklin scandal. I'm King Trout, and this one isn't going to be fun. Let's begin at the top. Lawrence E. King Jr. wasn't your average credit union manager. He wore silk suits, and he hosted private jet parties. He even sang the national anthem at Republican conventions. King had ties to some of the most powerful people in the country at the time. He also managed the Franklin Community Credit Union, which was a small-time bank in northern Omaha, Nebraska, meant primarily to serve the local black community. Things got a bit fishy in the mid-'80s, since the credit union was handling $40 million in assets, and King was living like a Saudi prince. He reportedly spent approximately $10,000 a month on travel and entertainment expenses, had luxury clothes flown in from Europe, and rented multiple properties both in Omaha, Nebraska, as well as Washington, D.C. He was getting paid a salary of $16,000 a year at the time. A 1988 audit by the National Credit Union Association found massive discrepancies. There were missing funds, phony loans, shell companies, but the investigation, while looking for embezzlement, stumbled upon something much more sinister. In 1988, the Nebraska State Senate developed a committee to investigate the crimes committed by the credit union and by King. This committee was led by State Senators Loren Schmidt and Ernie Chambers. The committee investigated the financial crimes committed by the credit union and King until December 12, 1988, when Senator Chambers received an allegation from a source who has never been named, claiming allegations of physical and assault against children. Just a few days later, on December 19, 1988, members of the Foster Care Review Board stepped forward with more allegations they had received from children related to physical and assault tied to the credit union and the King himself. The committee hired an investigator, Jerry Lowe, a former Lincoln policeman, to investigate these claims. By July of 1989, Lowe had compiled a mass of secondhand evidence, primarily including witness testimony related to the accusations of abuse. He also found financial records that tied the Omaha chief of police with King, proving that he had spent time at one of King's properties in Washington, D.C. However, since this evidence was primarily secondhand, there wasn't anything physical or concrete, Senator Schmidt feared they wouldn't be able to make any convictions. So Senator Chambers stepped down, as did investigator Lowe. In August of 1989, the committee hired a former state patrolman, Gary Caradori, to handle the investigation. This is when things took a far darker turn. Caradori made it his goal to find potential victims who may have been too afraid to step forward on their own. One of the first accusers that he found was a man named Paul Bonacci. And before you even say it, I know technically that should be pronounced Bonacci, but Paul pronounces it Bonacci, so that's how I'm going to say it. Whatever, it's his name. Located just outside of Omaha is a place called Boys Town. It was once a symbol of American compassion. It was founded in 1917 as a home for at-risk youth. Multiple witnesses, however, including Bonacci himself, claimed that Boys Town was being used as essentially a recruiting ground. He claimed that he and other Boys Town kids were being trafficked out of the orphanage to high-level events. Not just creepy, eyes-wide-shut parties, but coordinated trafficking rings involving handlers, photographers, and people in very, very high places of power. There are accusations that the Boys Town staff were complicit with this, or at the very least, they were willfully ignorant. King had close ties to Boys Town. He made donations and reportedly visited frequently. Why would he do that? Now, Bonacci was diagnosed with what we now call dissociative identity disorder, but used to be called multiple personality disorder, likely because of the intense abuse that he suffered in his youth. Remember that, it will come up later. But he wasn't just ranting in vague terms. He gave specific details: names, locations, hotels, flight paths, rituals, clothing. He claimed he was taken to New York, LA, and Washington, D.C. to be trafficked. He claimed he was at parties with high-level businessmen and politicians. And he remembered a photographer named Rusty Nelson who allegedly documented all of this for blackmail purposes. In 1986, a 17-year-old girl and her mother filed a police report with the Omaha Police Department related to Rusty Nelson. They alleged that Nelson had approached the girl to take photographs for her for a European modeling portfolio. They went to his apartment, and over the course of the 5-hour session, he made inappropriate comments about the underage girl and attempted to convince her to remove her clothing. And the mother reported that while in his apartment, she had noticed photographs of nude individuals who she believed to be minors. During the interaction with the girls, Nelson claimed that he was self-employed, but also made reference to a man who he called the boss. 9 days later, the Omaha police went to Nelson's apartment and found that it had been entirely vacated. Now, what's interesting there is that the name on the lease of the apartment that Nelson was staying in at the Twin Towers building in Omaha, Nebraska, was in the name of Lawrence King. Not only did King rent that apartment, he also rented the penthouse apartment of the Twin Towers. Yeah, I know. It's low-hanging fruit. When asked about this, King claimed he had heard about the allegations against Nelson and had kicked him out of the apartment. When asked about King, the owner of the building claimed that he was very heavily involved in drug trade and had a penchant for young boys. Nelson was not indicted on these charges and disappeared for a few years, but don't worry, he'll come back. Of the accusers that Caradori found and interviewed, there were 4 in total who allowed for their interviews to be recorded. Those 4 were Alisha Owens, Danny King, Troy Boner, come on guys, serious topic, and the aforementioned Paul Bonacci. Alisha Owen told Caradori that in August of 1983, when she was only 14 years old, she was approached by Troy Boner and another kid from Boys Town to come with them to a party on the penthouse floor of the Twin Towers building. This party, of course, being hosted by Lawrence King Jr. Alisha Owen stated that at this party there were approximately 10 men and nearly triple that in children. And she went to multiple parties on the penthouse floor of the Twin Towers building over the course of the next few months. She alleged that she was abused by multiple men. She alleged in these interviews with Caradori that while at these parties, she was abused by Alan Baer of wealthy Omaha businessmen, as well as Harold Anderson, head of the Nebraska State Police. Remember these accusations, put a pin in them, we'll circle back around. When asked about the presence of satanic rituals, Owen stated there was a house in Leavenworth with a pentagram painted on the kitchen floor, and a man named King's Horses would lead satanic rituals in the house, all of which King Jr. would be in attendance of, as would Rusty Nelson, who was documenting it all. Next on Caradori's list of those to be interviewed was Troy Boner. The night before their scheduled interview, Troy called Caradori, and he was freaking out. He was very suspicious of Caradori and wanted to know in what way he was tied to law enforcement. Caradori basically told him, hey, let's not talk about this on the phone. We'll meet up tomorrow and we'll talk about it. During this interview, Troy corroborated almost all of the details that Alisha Owen had shared with him previously, including names, locations. Some of the dates were moderately different, though. He said that while living in Boys Town, he was approached by another young boy to go and meet the aforementioned Alan Bear. He said that he was abused by Bear and paid hush money. He also said that Bear shared a photograph of him with Lawrence King Jr., after which Lawrence King Jr. met with Troy in a different apartment in the Twin Towers building. He claimed that he was repeatedly abused by the men and paid hush money, essentially, and also that there was another victim that they should speak with, Danny King. The next day, Caradori and Troy picked up King, and the stories were all the same. A repeated cycle of abuse. He could name names, he could pinpoint locations. He was driven around town by Caradori, physically shown where these abuses had taken place. These witness statements were stacking up, and Caradori and Schmidt were unsure how to proceed because of how closely tied the alleged abusers were within the politics and policing of Omaha. They needed hard evidence to bring these men down. And that's when the victims suggested he go visit Rusty Nelson, the photographer who documented it all. In July of 1990, Caradori flew himself and his 8-year-old son in a single-engine plane to Chicago, Illinois, to meet with a confidential source. Now, that confidential source is not named in any official records, but Nelson himself claims that it was him that Caradori was meeting with. Caradori brought his son with him because after he met with his source, the two were going to attend the MLB All-Star Game being held that evening. After he met with his source, he made a phone call to Senator Lawrence Schmidt, claiming that he had everything that they needed. He had the evidence. That evening, he and his son attended the baseball game. After the baseball game had ended, they got back to their plane to begin their return flight to Nebraska in the early hours of the next morning. Can you guess what happened? Witnesses claim they saw a flash, and over Illinois, the plane disintegrated in midair. No flight recorder was ever recovered, and no evidence of mechanical failure ever surfaced. Apparently, all of the evidence was destroyed in the crash, because despite the fact that his son's backpack had been discovered by the fuselage, the briefcase that Caradori carried with him everywhere, which those close to him insisted he would have kept the evidence inside of, was never found. Gary Caradori's wife and Senator Schmidt were convinced he was assassinated, as was nearly anyone else who was following the case. The day after the plane crash, the FBI raided Caradori's office with subpoenas for all of the evidence that he had collected. The day after the plane crash, the FBI raided Caradori's office with subpoenas for all of the evidence that he had collected. The day after, the committee hired former director of the CIA, William Colby, to investigate the accident. Colby had been in a bit of hot water in the past for kind of letting the veil slide a bit on some of the things the CIA was up to. And allegedly, he warned Senator Schmidt to be careful what he looked into. He found no wrongdoing, because of course he didn't. Shortly after Caradori's death, both Troy Boner and Danny King recanted everything that they had said, for no reason whatsoever, I'm sure. They claimed that Alisha Owen had told them to make it all up. The Franklin Committee was dissolved and a federal grand jury was convened. Despite the mounting evidence, reports from multiple victims, credit union reports, ties to Boys Town in D.C., the jury concluded that it was all a hoax, that the victims were lying. It was simple. No trafficking had occurred. None of the accused were ever convicted of abuse. There were only 2 convictions made by the jury. One to Lawrence King Jr., For the financial crimes he had committed, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. And the other to Alisha Owens, one of the accusers. She was also sentenced to 15 years in prison, but she was convicted of perjury for refusing to recant her statements that she had made previously. She was called a liar and a perjurer, and sentenced to 15 years in prison, despite the fact that none of her claims were ever disproven. Was Alisha Owens imprisoned to serve as a warning to any others who dared step forward? I don't know, but check this out. Bill Baker was a restaurant owner. He knew King and was allegedly partnered with him in his pornography operations. He was found dead with a gunshot wound to the back of the head. Sean Boner, the brother of Troy Boner, obviously, was found dead in 1991 with a gunshot wound to the head. Aaron Owen, Alisha Owens' brother, was found hanging from a ventilator in his prison cell in 1990. Claire Howard, Alan Baer's personal secretary who had access to all of his personal schedules related to his visits with King Jr., mysteriously died in her sleep in 1991. Dan Ryan, an associate of King's, was found suffocated in his vehicle. Charlie Rogers, another associate of King's, was found shot in the head. Joe Malik, another associate of King's, was found with a gunshot wound to the head. Curtis Tucker, yet another associate of King's, was found. No, he was either thrown or jumped out of the window of a Holiday Inn. Harmon Tucker, a man who ran several vocationary schools in the Omaha area, was reported missing in 1989, and his body was found roughly 1,000 miles away with a gunshot wound to the head near a hunting property frequented by Anderson. And William Colby, the former CIA director who was hired by the committee to investigate the plane crash, well, one day he decided to go out on a solo canoe trip, and his body was found days later. Troy Boner, who earlier had recanted his story, attempted to reverse his recantation. He died in a hospital waiting room, allegedly screaming about being followed. What if it's all true? What if the Franklin scandal wasn't just about one man's crimes, but a vast network that spans over the police, politicians, the media, all attempting to cover up, this network of sex trafficking related to children, wherein they blackmail and manipulate each other for power, all while abusing children, committing horrific crimes, and getting away with it because of the institutional rot. Well, obviously not. The grand jury found him innocent. None of that happened. And it'll never happen again. As always, I've been King Trout. I'll see you when I see you. I need a fucking beer.